Welcome to Lesson 11 in Module 223, Advanced Ethics. This is the last lecture video or core lecture video. There may be some optionals that are prepared along the way, but it's also one of the most important ones. And it's critical that you understand this because now that we've understood some of these principles, we need to be able to apply them. So we're going to start by talking about the way that we test the ethics when we're presented with real life scenarios, and then what we do depending on that test outcome. So we talked about it earlier. A lot of people use their instincts or feelings to decide if something is ethical or unethical, but that's not enough. At the same time, I don't want us to discount our feelings or our instincts. Instead, we can call that the smell test or the sniff test. If you open your refrigerator and you smell a bad smell, you don't immediately throw away all of the food. You start investigating and trying to find out what might be wrong there. And that's what we want to do here. That smell test should tell us that something might be wrong and then have us spend the time and the focus to be more analytical. That analytical process that we went through earlier of checklisting and that we'll explore more in other slides here is what will tell us what exactly is wrong. And then from there, we'll then be able to decide what to do. In some cases, what we'll conclude is that people have not done things that are unethical. They have simply done things that are a different practice than we might support. They did things a way that we don't like. And when that happens, we're going to have a very different approach. When something does something that's a practice difference, they're using methods that we don't prefer, but they're still ethical. And there can be quite a large divide between the practices that people like to use. For example, I used to work in a home where the staff people served all the supported people all of the food for the meal in the kitchen and then brought out the pre-served plates to the table. I found this quite offensive. It was like little children being served in my mind, even though we were working with adults. However, they explained to me that there were so many people at the table who would tend to grab food from the plates in the middle, they were concerned about sanitation. They were worried about safety. At the end of the day, they had a principled approach, but I felt my approach was more principled. What did we do? We talked about it, and we came up with a solution that provided for the sanitation as well as giving people more power. What did we do? Well, we put out small portions of food so that if somebody touched it, it wasn't going to waste the whole meal. And surprise, surprise, we taught people good sanitation and good table manners so that they could be more independent. That conversation improved practice. If I had simply gone and reported this behavior as unethical, I probably would have created conflict where none was necessary. Unethical behavior, when it occurs, does not ask us to go and deal with people face to face. Instead, this is a circumstance where it's clear that people have violated the very underpinning principles of our profession, and therefore we have to act in a very proactive and distinctive way. And again, remember that unethical behavior can be evidenced by people doing things they should not have done or by not doing things that they should have done. The absence or omission of something that a reasonable professional would have done. What we need to do after we've figured this out is decide what to do with that information. It's not enough to simply say, oh, I know the name of that principle, or that was a practice difference. It is of no use to anybody to simply give a name to the problem. We are expected, whether it's a practice difference or an ethics difference, to take action with the aim of making things better or resolving the situation. We must know what to do as a result. So here's step one. First, you're going to ask yourself, are you certain that the behavior you're concerned about actually occurred? If the answer is yes, we'll move down to step two. If it's no, we might investigate further, with one exception that we've already learned. If I suspect abuse, then I don't do the investigation myself. I report the behavior and document. So at the point where I say I suspect abuse, I change my behavior and report it. That's the only instance where we do this. Remember that abuse can include financial abuse. Was a principle violated is step two. Or was it simply a matter of the behavior being practice differences? How do I do that? Well, I get out my list of principles and I start using a checklist approach. If something has violated a principle, the way I behave is to go to somebody who's a superior and I report it. There are very few instances where that's not the case. One of them might be because there isn't a superior. So That superior will then need to make a decision about what to do. And staff often conclude that that report will automatically lead to somebody being fired, and that simply isn't true. People might be cautioned, re-educated, reassigned, suspended, or censured. A censure is a document that goes in their file that says you've been warned. And if it's a practice difference, typically our action is very different. Rather than going to our supervisor, we go to the person directly and give feedback. We don't go to anybody else. We go directly to that person. And if we feel that we've done that and it hasn't led to anything improving, or we don't feel safe doing that because there's been some kind of history of conflict, then we can go to our supervisor and ask them for advice or mediation. But we're not finished the decision-making process. Well, was the behavior risky, dangerous, and or illegal? Well, in that case, I have to also report it and intervene to protect the person. So it's not enough for me just to be able to say I reported it. If I have any concerns about immediate safety of people, I have to do something that will intervene and protect the individual. And by that way, that doesn't mean I necessarily need to be in conflict with the person that I think has done something wrong. Sometimes it's a subtle thing that I can do to separate people, for example. If it was a practice difference and I don't think the behavior was risky, then I'm going to do a strategic approach. I'm going to decide the best time and way and approach to take to talk to that person. And it doesn't necessarily need to happen urgently. And what if it was an unethical behavior, but it wasn't risky or having some immediate impact? Then I'm going to go to my supervisor and report it. What if I see the situation improves? Great. Whether it was practice or whether it was ethics, I would consider it to be a resolved situation if my action caused me to see improvement. But if I don't see improvement, I cannot say I'm done. I've tried and therefore I'm not going to try again. That's not the way it works. I have a duty to report it again, and that might involve reporting it to the same person or reporting it higher if I felt that there was an issue with the last person's approach. And if it was a situation where I needed to go and give more feedback to somebody, I might try to resolve it by going back to them a second time. However, typically if I've already gone and talked to that person and it hasn't made any result, I am going to go higher. That's the typical second step if you've approached a coworker. We call this process of going through all of the principles and checklisting the acid test. In other words, we sort of take that case example and put it through the ringer and see whether or not it sets off any of the alarms. In order to do that, we have to apply all of the principles. We don't stop after we find out that the first principle has not been violated, nor that the first principle has been violated. We have to apply all of them. And it's a really common thing for people to say that they violated the principles because they were upholding another principle. For example, if an individual said, I know I wasn't supposed to have a relationship with this client, but the client's really trying to tell me that they need this in their life, and isn't it an example of inclusion for me to do this? No, it doesn't work that way. You have to find a way of being inclusive at the same time as you maintain that body privacy, just as two examples. All of the principles, as I said earlier, are considered equally important. The degree of misconduct, as I mentioned in another video, is not connected to how many principles are violated. It really isn't about that. A better barometer of harm or potential harm, intent, and the vulnerability of the victims, that would change the way I acted or send me to a more urgent course of action as opposed to having more boxes ticked. Sometimes, as I said earlier, harm and damage occur even when people have behaved ethically. And so I shouldn't assume that because somebody got hurt, something was done unethically. A CSW can probably explain in some of those cases how they've done what they should have done. If they can do that, then chances are it wasn't unethical. But realize something else. People sometimes say, I didn't mean to do anything bad. That's not an excuse for unethical behavior. You're supposed to know these rules and principles, and you're supposed to actively and mindfully attempt to behave in a way that complies with them. If you don't know them, that's an example of lacking currency and competency. And if you do know them, but you come to work being ill-equipped and not mentally present, then there are questions about your personal fitness and safety. So you do not have to be mean-spirited or a bad person to behave unethically. Sometimes people do it just by being careless or poorly informed. Some rules to remember as you're reporting. We never report anonymously because when we report anonymously, we make it very difficult for people in authority to act. They will maintain your confidentiality already. Don't stand by and tolerate unethical behavior, hoping it'll get better. A, it almost never does. And B, if you've witnessed unethical behavior, as strange as you might think it sounds to say this, you have had an opportunity presented to you. Most of the time, people try to conceal unethical behavior. So, the fact that you got to see it is a good news story because it's a good chance that the behavior was happening before you or other people witnessed it and will continue as long as nobody's witnessing it. Don't violate the confidentiality of your peers or your agency. In other words, after something has been reported, don't go and tell it to other people. You have to go directly to the person in authority and not further than that. Don't make false or exaggerated reports. This is a common issue in our field. People sometimes get bitter towards coworkers and make claims that are not true, sometimes for reasons that are about their emotions and sometimes for self-serving gain. Or sometimes people think they need to exaggerate a report to make it more likely somebody will take action. But as soon as they do that, they add a degree of dishonesty to that report and they make it difficult for anybody to act on it. Don't delay your documentation. Sometimes all you have is a piece of paper randomly laying around, a scrap or a napkin. Even if that's the only thing you have, keeping notes and recording what you saw adds a degree of verisimilitude to that, a degree of authenticity. And so make sure you document and report promptly and keep those documented notes. Don't report laterally. Don't take the information to other coworkers or to your union, because when you do that, you're just gossiping and you're actually making it much more likely that the person will hear that you have complained about them. They will likely become defensive or even offensive and you'll become at risk. Instead, go up the ladder. Don't expect to be told afterwards what the people did. In the same way as they would maintain your confidentiality if a report came in about you, they will do the same thing. You should be able to see a difference in the practice or outcome. Maybe the person doesn't work there anymore, or maybe the person is going to a course, or maybe the person's behavior just improves. But nobody is going to come and tell you, we suspended Johnny, or we fired Johnny, or we gave Johnny a verbal warning. And don't quit as a way of dealing with these problems. When you do that, eventually all the ethical people leave the organization, and the only ones who stay are the turkeys. We don't want to be surrounded by turkeys because there's an old expression, it's hard to soar like an eagle when all the other birds are turkeys. It's really important for us to be a part of what keeps the culture of that organization from eroding, or a better way of putting it, helps it to continue being good. So this is the moment when you're most needed. When you see behavior that is not good, it's time to act and not to leave it on the plate for other people. Some do's. Do's suggest alternatives when you see something that is a practice difference. Do have an open mind and a conversational approach that allows the other person to be honored and appreciated because they might have a good reason for what they're doing. Do participate in promoting ethics and values. So if there's courses or discussions where you work, be encouraging of people and take part in them because you'll make the culture of doing that much more popular. Do act quickly when you see things that are not okay, and you'll start to create the culture that way too. Do expect results. Do model the behavior yourself, and do demonstrate openness and accountability at all times. All right, by now we've already gone through these instructions, but I wanted to make sure that you had a recording of these instructions so that you'd be able to go back and check them anytime. You'll be asked to choose one of the 3 cases presented in the package. You're allowed to collaborate with other people on the response that you give, but you must submit work on your own. It's an individual and unique written assignment. If you choose to use any sources other than the ones provided in the course, you'll have to cite them using APA. And here are the 3 questions I want you to make sure you answer in your response. First, has anyone violated any principles in your case? And if so, name those principles and explain, based on information in the case, how they have been violated. Number 2, describe what is the best way to proceed. The scenarios you're presented with are sort of half done. What should happen next? Explain fully, showing how the behavior that you take will satisfy the acid test or check all the principle boxes. Number 3, can you think of other practices that somebody could use that would also be ethical, even if they aren't ones that you prefer? Describe some of those practices and explain again why you chose the ones that you liked in number 2. Why are those ones better than the ones that you came up with in number 3? A common thing I see people do here is skip through question number 3. And I would strongly encourage you not to do that. I want you to really get good at recognizing that there's more than one way for people to do things. And being able to describe actual courses of action and be able to explain why your course of action seems better to you is important. Many times people describe things that are not other practices, but are additional practices. So be careful. What you do in question 3 should be different from what you do in question 2, not something that you could also have done in question 2. You can answer this question and answer, you can answer this assignment in question and answer format by putting the questions at the top and your answers below. And yes, as always, it should be typed. You can submit it through the portal and make sure that the file name says ethics and your last name.